Good evening, everyone. Man and animal has a good bonding, and animals are equally important in the biosphere. But when we talk about the microorganism, how we can study them when we are talking about the ecology. So, in order to understand the statistical ecology and how microbes survive in the extreme and this deep subsurface biosphere, we need to learn in our today guest session. So please with us for today's guest session up to this hour. Hello everyone, this is Karishma Sharma and I welcome all of you in our today's session that is organized by Bioanalytics Development Forum.
Hi, hello everyone. Am I audible?
You're audible, Saurav. Thank you,
Okay,
Saurav,
okay.
for
Yeah,
being with us.
thanks, Karishma, for this very generous introduction. Yes, as you have rightly pointed out, that I had been working on deep subsurface microbiology. I'm a computational biologist by training, but today I'll be talking about something very different. I'll be talking about maybe first I share my slide deck and see whether that's visible. Uh,
Definitely you can. So just to interrupt for the same, I would like to tell to my all the viewers, well, Mr. Sourav Mukhopadhay is a PhD student of National University of Singapore, where he is on a mission to save tropical wetlands using the magic of statistical ecology. He is also driving towards the world of peatlands, and Saurabh has earned his master's degree from IIT Kharagpur and exploring how microbes survive in this extreme deep subsurface biosphere. So I hope you are going to learn today a so much adventurous academic important related part of this microbes and their role in ecology. So now, Saurabh, it's up to you. You can start. Thank you.
okay. Thank you so much for this very generous introduction. And also a vote of thanks to Dr. Deep for connecting me with the team. Uh, okay, so I'll talk today about this multidimensional tropical forest recovery. Now I understand that this topic might be a bit outlandish for the healthcare researchers. However, I think it's the need of the hour to talk about deforestation and the devastating impact it has on climate change and on our society as a whole. So I'll be talking about this paper that in something is wrong. Let me just see why it's not moving. Uh, is the screen moving? Karishma, can you confirm whether the screen is moving or not?
Your slides are changing, like it's a research
Okay,
article now.
okay. Thanks so much. I just wanted that info. Okay, so I'll be talking about this paper recently published by one of my collaborators in Science that talks about multi-dimensional tropical forest recovery. It's very important to model the recovery of the tropical forest, which are being deforested to a large extent. So without further ado, I'll dive right onto the topic. And let me start with what are tropical forests? Very intuitive, right? The forest in the tropics are the tropical forest. The vegetation, mainly in the equatorial region, which is usually characterized by warm climatic condition and very high rainfall as well. Now, why they are important? Because they provide a lot of ecosystem services. They represent a huge store of carbon, biodiversity hotspot. Usually, this tropical forests are, and also they provide a lot of other service provisioning, including water regulation, timber and non-timber forest products and stuff. So what is the major problem that they are facing, this tropical forest? That is deforestation due to land use change. If you look at the data of the deforestation in the last 2 decades, where the red color shows the extreme extent of the deforestation, we can see it's mostly concentrated across the tropics and the neotropics. Now, once there is a deforestation or the loss of the forest cover, it's highly probable that the new vegetation will come up And this is called secondary regrowth or secondary succession. Here I introduce the paper that proposes that the secondary forest should be embraced as a low-cost natural solution for complete ecosystem reclamation. Also, please, I want to make the session very easygoing. Whenever you feel that there's a need to clarify something, please feel free to interrupt. Okay, so getting back, so this is the paper that proposes secondary forest as a strategy for the recovery of the deforested region. Now, why secondary forest? Because even after deforestation, right, there is a legacy effect from the previous forest in terms of developed soil, seed bank, remnant trees, and stuff that makes the natural regrowth of the forest highly probable. And how widespread the secondary forests are, right? So the regrowth or regeneration covers as much as 28% of the forest cover of the neotropic. Now, how to benchmark this secondary succession or the recovery, right? So we'll be playing around with some terms related to recovery, like resilience, resistance, recovery, and succession. Now, I'll mainly be talking about three states: old growth forest, that is like the intact forest, and then disturbed forest, and then recovered forest. Now, how do we define resilience, right? The ability of an intact forest to resist the effect of disturbance. By disturbance, I mean land use change and then agricultural repurposing and how they affect the forest function, right? And so the definition of resilience has two facets to it: ability to resist disturbance and also the ability to recover post disturbance. Now, think of this relaxed spring as the values that represent the old growth forest parameters. For example, tree diameter or specific leaf area and stuff. Now, after disturbances, there will be some changes in the values of the forest parameter. Now, think of it as the compressed spring for the disturbed forest. Now, this changes in the values upon disturbance, right? That's called the resistance of the forest. And how to define recovery? The ability of this compressed spring or the disturbed forest attribute values to get back to its original position is termed as recovery. It's often described as a function of time. And what is succession? Succession is a subjective term as opposed to this quantifiable resistance and recovery terms. Succession is a concept that talks about the changes in the vegetation structure, species composition, diversity, and other ecosystem functions over time after a disturbance. Now, all these parameters to be considered for us for different forest parameters, like resilience in terms of different forest parameters like diversity, forest structure, leaf area, and stuff. So how do we select these forest parameters that would help us to benchmark the forest recovery? So there are some recommendations regarding this. So Tillman says that the attributes should have a functional aspect that should talk about the functionality of the forest. It should be quantifiable as well. And these attributes should provide a mechanistic explanation of the forest recovery. Now, there has been a plethora of such forest attributes, but they can be majorly subdivided into four broad categories. For example, species composition that has been used to describe forest recovery by Tillman, where he identified and explained broad patterns of the structure and dynamics of plant communities upon disturbance. Species richness has also been used for describing the forest recovery by Cornell, where he says that the high species diversity, we all know that tropical rainforests are highly diverse, right? But that's not a stable state. That's what Cornell says. He says that it usually approaches towards a low diversity equilibrium. However, whenever there is a disturbance, right, there will be niche diversification because of partitioning of the nutrients in the soil and the environment. And that would trigger the diversity. So species richness is another parameter that is sensitive to disturbance, and consecutively, we can use them to benchmark forest recovery. Forest structure has also been utilized by Oliver and Larson to describe disturbance. Previously, the disturbance has been treated as a black box. Now, the disturbance patterns lead to changes in the forest structure over time. That's why the forest structure can be another parameter which is sensitive to disturbance and can be used as a forest attribute to describe recovery or to benchmark recovery. Another parameter is soil function related parameter that's very intuitive. So whenever there is a deforestation, right, there will be changes in the soil organic matter, soil microbial communities, and these functional traits can be used to study ecological succession as well. That has also been demonstrated by Waka et al. Now, these functional attributes are mostly interdependent, right? Because your tree species composition and species richness would always depend on the condition of the soils. What are the microbial communities residing in the soil, what is the soil organic matter and stuff. But most of the studies that has been done on tropical forest recovery or forest recovery as a whole, that has been done in isolation. They have either talked about species composition or richness or soil parameters. Now studying these parameters in isolation leads to less precise conclusions, because it's like you are looking at something with one eye open. So you are not getting the holistic view of that object, right? So it eventually leads to the knowledge gap that it has, that this paper tries to address, is a holistic and quantitative understanding of the recovery of multiple secondary forest function is required, that can be used to design effective policies that would benefit the environment and people and the society as a whole. And the benefit would translate from the local to the global scales as well. And another knowledge gap would be the functional attributes of the successions, as I was mentioning, that they have been studied in isolation. So our integrative framework is required to conceptually assess the recovery of the secondary forest functions. Now, this paper tries to address these knowledge gaps through these objectives. So these are fairly simple three objectives. First is, how do multiple forest attributes recover during succession? That means natural regrowth. So once your forest gets deforested, the naturally the trees come up, and how different forest attributes like or tree diameter, specific leaf area, species richness, how that recover over time, right? Second is, how are the recoveries of these attributes are interrelated, how they are correlated. And third is, most importantly, can one or several attributes be used as a simple proxy for multidimensional recovery? Why multidimensional? Because the recovery of the forest can happen in different dimensions. For example, in terms of tree species, tree richness, and then in terms of forest structural heterogeneity, in terms of soil health, right? So can one or several attributes be used as a proxy for this forest recovery? And the novelty of this study, while it tries to address these questions, is that it includes a wider range of forest attributes, not only one specific group of forest attributes, right? And also, it develops and applies an original conceptual integrative framework for modeling the forest recovery over time. Also, it examines how recovery among the forest attributes, different forest features, are interrelated. And most importantly, it tries to give some recommendations on what attributes could be used as simple indicators to monitor the recovery or the progress of forest reclamation. Now, let us take a look at the overview of the methods that has been employed for this study. So first, it has selected 77 sites, which is part of 12 countries and 3 continents. Just to give an idea that This kind of sampling requires a lot of logistics. And doing that across 77 sites across 3 continents, it's a nightmare. So this is one of the major strengths of the paper, that it has a huge amount of data, so the analysis would be able to provide more reliable conclusions. Second thing, it tries to employ something called chrono-sequence approach. I'd be talking about what is chrono-sequence approach in my subsequent sections. And also it tries to model the absolute recovery of these forest functions like tree diameter, leaf area, diversity over successional time. And however, it's very important to mention the modeling. It's more like demonstrative modeling. It tries to show the trajectory of the recovery rather than doing specific quantifiable predictions. So the predictions would have a quantum of errors as well, but it would try to rightly predict the trajectory of the recovery. And thirdly, it does a network analysis to see how these forest attributes are interlinked. Okay, so in terms of site selection and plotting, you see that all the 77 sites are from the tropics, focus on neotropics and West Africa region. These sites cover a latitudinal gradient in lowland subtropics as well. And also, all these plots, like around 0.5 hectares, inclusive of woody plants, were made for sampling for all these 77 sites. And for all these sites, they had multiple sites closer together as well. And why is that? I'll talk about that in this site. Now, in this slide, now think about these 3 sites, right? Site A, Site B, and Site C. Most important thing about these 3 sites are these 3 sites are close together. Now, for the Site A, it says early stage. That means, for example, a disturbance has happened just 5 years ago. So there are less trees. There is a nearby site, which is called Site B. The disturbance happened 10 years ago. That's why there is more trees. And for this one, the disturbance happened, for example, 15 years ago. So there are more amount of trees. But all these sites being very closer together, having very similar environmental conditions and very similar forest structure, we can assume that after 5 years, the condition of site A would be very similar to site B. And after 10 years, the condition of site A would be very similar to site C. That's called space for time substitution. So we are substituting space for time to see how the recovery is happening. And that's called the chronosequence approach. And for this study, they have considered 4 groups of attributes. First is diversity and composition of trees. Second is forest structure. Third is plant functioning. And fourth is soil functioning. Now I'll go into details about these groups of attributes. For the diversity and composition, they have focused on the number of locally co-occurring species and termed them as species richness. They have also focused on the resemblance of the species composition of an area to that of an old growth forest or a nearby intact forest. And also, they have focused on the diversity of the common species. That's like Simpson diversity of the trees. And then they have also talked about the forest structure, like above ground biomass, and that's assumable from the amount of vegetation, the maximum tree diameter, because the tree that has higher logs, that has more significance in terms of conservation, carbon storage, and other factors in nutrient cycling as well. And then structural heterogeneity of the forest, which is variations in the tree size. And another group of attributes is where they have talked about wood density, where they have just obtained the ratio of wood dry mass upon the stem volume, and then specific leaf area, and then potential for nitrogen fixation. And in terms of soil functioning, they have looked into the bulk density, soil dry mass upon the soil volume, total carbon, and total nitrogen. And these are these four groups of attributes that they have used for this study. And what did they do? There are two facets to it. First part, they have tried to model the absolute recovery of these attributes over successional time. And this recovery was expressed by calculating the similarity with the old growth forest values. Now, this is just to give you a overall view. I'll go into the equations as well in the later parts. And then they tried to do the network analysis to see how recovery of different forest attributes are interlinked and how one forest attributes is linked to the recovery of other forest attributes so that it has more contribution towards the recovery of the forest as a whole. For example, if recovery of one forest attribute is interlinked with a lot of other forest attributes, that means that is highly interlinked and that has higher age values. I'll talk about age values later as well, and it would have higher influence on the recovery. Now, it tries to answer the first research question, that how do different forest attributes recover during succession? So, if you remember that I talked about resilience as the ability to resist disturbance. How do you define this mathematically, right? So after the disturbance, you look at the values of the forest attributes and see how much change has happened after the disturbance when you compare them with the intact forest. So you have intact forest, you have disturbed forest, you see the difference in the values. So lower the difference, that means it has more resistance. Higher the difference, it means it has lower resistance. And then second part is ability to recover after disturbance. So there is a change after disturbance of a forest attribute, for example, wood diameter or leaf area. Then over time, it changes. And that's called the recovery. So I'm not going into the technical details of it. If you ask, then I'll go into more detail. Now I'm trying to put it very simply. So for a specific attribute at time t, the value is AT. A start is the value of a forest attribute right after disturbance. Why start? Because that's the start of the secondary succession or the revegetation. So if the deforestation happens, right after the deforestation, that's the phase when the secondary succession or the natural regrowth starts happening, right? So A start is the starting point of the succession, and that's the attribute value at the starting point of the succession, plus the difference, the resistance. That is attribute value of the old growth forest or the intact forest minus the value at the start of the succession, and that's compounded by a decay function, exponential decay function, 1 minus e upon minus lambda, where lambda is the intrinsic recovery rate. So this recovery of different functions, right? So it usually changes over time, and the rate is usually exponential. The trend is usually exponential. Now, for example, this attributes might increase or might decrease. For example, the soil bulk density that decreases over time, that shows more recovery, right? And then other attributes that increases over time, for example, leaf area, specific leaf area, wood diameter, like tree diameter, that increases over time, that shows recovery as well. And the relative recovery rate at time t is, you can think of it as a resemblance or similarity to the old growth forest values. That's like e exponential of minus ln of attribute value at time t upon attribute value of the intact forest. So what's going on here? So they are trying to model the recovery of a specific forest attribute over time and trying to assess the intrinsic recovery rate as well. Now, if you look at the recoveries, right? So here, what's going on in this graph? So all these brown lines, these are related to soil parameters. For example, BD is bulk density, C is soil total carbon, N is total soil nitrogen, and the purple ones are related to plant functions. SLA is specific leaf area, WB is wood density, NF is nitrogen fixation. What you see here is this is the time of succession, and then this is the relative recovery rate, right? So at time zero, you see that very less changes. So this is at time zero. That means right after disturbance. You see the values, this is the 100%. So the values has changed just to 90% for the soil attributes, soil related attributes, and plant function related attributes. So all this brown and purple lines, these are above around 40. So they have higher resistance as compared to diversity and like diversity related parameters and forest structure related parameters. You see above ground biomass is at zero. That's very intuitive because if you have deforestation, there is no trees at all. So there is no above ground biomass. The species richness, if there is loss of forest cover, a lot of species would go away, right? Like the ones who are like usually extensively dependent on tree shelters. So the tree diameter, species diversity, above ground biomass, these are very less resistant, and these are highly resistant. And you see this soil recovers faster as well. You see this is the mark of 20 years, and this soil and plant function related parameters that recovers pretty fast, whereas the above ground biomass, forest structure related parameters, structural heterogeneity, and above ground biomass, they take a lot of time, around 100 years, right, to get back to its original positions. So the modeling of specific trait shows differential recovery rate over time, over successional time. Now, they try to model recovery of these attributes. Here, after 0 year, which means right after disturbance, they see the values. So these are highly resistant soil and plant functions. These are like more nearer to 100 as compared to other parameters related to forest structure and stuff. Now, the relative recovery after 20 years, you see most of the plant and soil functions have been recovered. So the recovery rate is pretty faster as well, whereas this other forest structure related parameters, they are very slow in terms of recovery as compared to other soil and plant function. And their relative recovery rate is also differential over time. So over time, their rate of recovery, rate of relative recovery changes as well. And if we take a look at what is the time that it would take for 90% recovery of the functional attributes, we see all these plant functions, it takes very less time for around 90% of recovery. But for other forest structure related functions, it takes a huge amount of time. Now, there is something very wrong, something is very off about these two graphs. It's like about all of the graphs, but especially about A and D. Like it doesn't have to be related to forest, it doesn't have to be related to ecology, anything, but just very intuitively, uh, there is something pretty off about this two graphs A and D. Anyone has any thoughts about this? Like, what might be wrong about these two graphs, A and D? Just to interact if anyone has any thoughts about this. Okay, so I'll just point out it's very very nominal thing, but the interquartile range of these values are pretty high, even if the means are at these points. But the interquartile range of these values, right? It's pretty high. So the confidence interval is highly skewed as well. So this is pretty normal when you do experiments at field, right? Because the field conditions have a lot of latent variables that you might not be accounting for. You might have a lot of collinear variables as well, so you don't know why these values are so skewed. So if you have such a skewed data set, then it becomes difficult to construct a network or try to model them to see their interrelatedness or interdependency as well. So there's something very interesting the way how they tried to model the interrelatedness. I'll talk about that shortly if someone is interested or asks me a question about it. So this slide is mostly about the modeling of the recovery rate of different functions, different forest attributes. Am I audible? Hello?
Yes. Yes.
Okay. So this slide mostly talks about the recovery rate of different forest attributes. So moving on to the second part, yes, where they try to assess how are the relative recovery of forest attributes might be interrelated. So the default hypothesis is that the forest attributes are strongly related. For example, the tree biomass would depend on the total soil carbon, right? Because the total soil organic carbon content would inform or shape the microbiome structure. That would also uh, create the environment for tree to grow up in a faster way as well, right? So there are multiple factors, multiple forest attributes which are highly correlated. So by default, the recovery of these functions would be interrelated as well, because the null tendency of these parameters are interrelated. So if you run a progression of those null distributions, they will be interrelated as well, right? So they do two kind of network analysis. Why two network analysis? Because about for all these 77 data sets, not all 12 attributes were available. Not all 12 sets of data were available for all 77 sites. So surprisingly, only for 17 sites, they had all these 12 values. So they tried to model this 17 sites, which is a complete correlation. They use the Pearson correlation here, and they see that there are three clusters in the network. So what's it? So all these nodes are different forest attributes, and they try to model the recovery based on their correlation. They try to model the recovery through a network, and upon each plane they try to look at the density function of these nodes. So they see that these parameters are highly correlated with each other, and then this cluster of parameters like species richness, species composition, specific leaf area, they are also highly correlated. And there is another cluster where the nitrogen fixation, bulk density, which is highly correlated. And even if you look at even if you think from a very subjective point of view, these parameters are highly correlated as well, because your total soil nitrogen, total soil carbon would affect the above ground biomass, highest tree, the maximum tree diameter, structural heterogeneity as well. And then they tried to do influence analysis. So what did they do for each node? They try to look at the connectivity or the modularity, and then they integrate it over a specific plane. So they see how one forest attribute is interlinked with other attributes. So you see this parameter, species composition, highest tree diameter, structural heterogeneity, that has higher influences over recovery because they are highly connected with other different forest parameters. Now, they did another analysis, which is a partial correlation analysis. Why? Because they tried to see that if they try to include a huge number of sites, for example, 74 sites, how many attributes they could still take in. So they could arrive at a trade-off values of 74 sites and 7 attributes. So that's why it's not taking into account all 12 attributes. So it's a partial correlation that they did with only 7 attributes, but they have included all the 74 sites, not 77, 74 sites. Now, what did they see is very similar patterns. Above ground biomass, maximum tree diameter, structural heterogeneity of the forest, they are interrelated. Species richness, species Simpson diversity, they are also correlated. And if you look at the previous one, right, SC, SH, Dmax, above ground biomass, all these values had higher influence. And if you see here as well, Dmax, structural heterogeneity, species richness, they also have higher influence on recovery of the forest function. And there are two clusters as well, two dimensions of recovery, I would say. Now, it takes us to the third and most important question, that is whether one or several attributes can be used as a simple proxy for multidimensional recovery. Now, which attributes can serve as indicators for ecosystem recovery? There are certain recommendations regarding that. It has to be easy to measure for ecosystem monitoring purposes. It cannot be very costly solution, and it cannot be very complicated as well. It has to be scalable, and the attributes should be slowly changing so that uh, you could monitor the progress over time in a systematic manner, and it has to be cost effective as well. So they see that this maximum tree diameter, structural heterogeneity, which had higher influence on the recovery, and that was part of different clusters as well, and species richness, they are pretty easy to measure. Structural heterogeneity, for that you need just different length of different trees. Maximum tree diameters are completely manual. Species richness you can uh, do by camera traps or manual counting and other stuffs. But for total carbon or soil bulk density, it needs different physical intervention and physical experiments, total nitrogen and wood density, specific leaf area, more complicated calculations. So this paper recommends, I think that's one of the major strength of this paper, that it recommends maximum tree diameter, structural heterogeneity, and species richness based on the findings of their results. They conclude that this parameters can be used as a proxy for monitoring the ecosystem recovery. Now, that was all about this paper. Now, let's try to summarize what they talked about in this paper. That they showed that this all attributes, all these 12 attributes, they recovered within around 12 decades after low to moderate intensity of land use. And also they showed differential rates of recovery across different dimensions. So these three cluster of attributes, right? Soil function, plant function, they recovered pretty fast, whereas the forest structure and the diversity recovered pretty slowly. And then they show that key attributes had different rates of recovery. Soil attributes, plant functions, fast recovery, whereas the structure and diversity had average recovery rate. Slowest recovery was for above ground biomass and species composition. But one of the strength of the paper, as I was trying to point out, that it carries out this research across a continental scale and then reaches a reliable conclusion in terms of recommendations which parameters can be used for ecosystem monitoring. And that has implications in policy making for natural ecosystem monitoring as well. And at the same time, I think it's like high time for us to develop awareness for protection of environment and natural ecosystem. Just to have a handle on how devastating the impact might be in terms of climate change if we do not focus on this ecosystem recoveries and ecosystem protection, environmental protection. And also, I think it's high time to open dialogues between the research community and the policymakers as well for for formulating more science-informed strategies for ecosystem monitoring and restoration. Yeah, so that's about it. That's my time. Please feel free to ask me any questions, any clarifications that you might have, because I know that this topic might be a bit distant from your research area and expertise as well. Yeah, thank you so much for this opportunity.
Thank you so much, Saurabh. That's really incredible presentation, I would like to say. And with the gesture which you have given while explaining, it shows that your interest. So I hope there may be some question from the audience. So you are open to ask your question. Please go ahead.
Yeah, like it doesn't have to be like very specific questions. If you have any clarifications that you might need related to whatever I talked about, or any suggestions, recommendation that you might have, I'd be very glad to open a dialogue with that.
Well, Saurabh, I have one question. Like
Yeah,
when you talked about that Pearson coefficient, okay? So
yeah.
why you have worked over this? There are so many tools that we are having in working on the Pearson coefficient for this data analysis. So what makes you to use that tool in your research and working on the same? And why did you choose this biosphere as your? What motivates you? The two questions.
Okay. Thank you so much for these questions. Okay, so yeah, so it's very intuitive. We used Pearson correlation because it's a very non-parametric data set, as I was telling you, right? It's very highly skewed data set, and very interesting fact, like as you had asked the question on like very similar, very similar facet, what I was alluding to, that for this kind of field data sets where the data is very skewed, non-parametric, right? How do we model them? It becomes very challenging for the test statisticians, right? So you would not believe that for this, if you go to the paper, then you can then you can then you would know that the algorithm they have used for the network analysis is called spin glass algorithm. And one of the amazing fact about the spin glass algorithm is that is mainly used in quantum physics to model the spin quantums of the electrons for a substance, for a type of material called spin glass. It's not like ferromagnetic or antiferromagnetic objects where you have like spins, anti-spins, and stuff. It's very skewed. And there they have first utilized this spin glass algorithm. And for this kind of network analysis, where it was very difficult even with Pearson to model the correlation, and thereafter the network analysis. So they use spin-glass algorithm with specific constraint, obviously, for the field data based on different priorities. As you have seen that they have used mainly Bayesian approach as opposed to frequentist approach, because they knew that there are some limitations regarding the tendency of each set of data, right? So they used this Pearson correlation first, which was not enough. And then for modeling the networks, they use spin-glass algorithm further to model the recovery of each state. And then why this biosphere, or why tropical forest? Because these tropical forests are one of the most carbon dense ecosystems of this earth. So there has been a very recent article in New York Times, some of you might have seen, that says this tropical forests are climate bombs which are waiting to be detonated, because the extent of deforestation highly destabilizes these ecosystems. And these ecosystems, which are usually carbon sources or that stores carbon, instantly converts into carbon sources, like sources of carbon emission from the sink. So that's why it's very important to talk about this tropical forest. So that's the second part. And for first part, I thought like I have answered. Did I answer your question, Karishma?
Yeah, it's perfectly understood.
Okay. There's another
Yeah,
question, I guess, in the chat.
yeah,
Uh,
yeah.
where I see, could you please explain how about the restoration of grasslands, which is one of the carbon sinks? It would be good to know how much time period for ecosystem restoration needed for different ecosystems. Okay, so this study, while it focused on mainly tropical forest that includes the rainforest and also the lowland forest or peat forest as well. However, it doesn't talk about the grasslands. Now, in terms of grasslands, the recovery should be benchmarked in terms of different parameters, because there you do not have woody plants, right? So maximum tree diameter, forest structure heterogeneity is not very relevant for the. And for grasslands, I think the focus mainly would be on the herbivore species diversity, on the soil health, and also the soil microbial communities as well. And then you have to do a very similar study to see the trajectories of the recovery. But I cannot give you any quantitative numbers in terms of that, but uh, I think it should be somewhat faster than the tropical forest, because this woody plants, they take more time to regrow, and that's why the recovery takes higher time. Even if in that paper they showed the modeling of this forest structure heterogeneity, and the recovery of those parameters took a huge amount of time. So for the grassland, it would be I think the recovery should be faster, but it also depends on the environmental conditions as well. So there is not a very straightforward answer to it. It's another research question, but these are the parameters. These are the differentials from this study, that the parameters would be different, that has to be differently modeled. And individually, I think that should be like the succession time and recovery would be lesser in time, I think. Yeah, that's about it, I guess. But yes, the like the deforestation of the grassland, I don't know how widespread that is, because sometimes this deforestation is happening even in the tropics for converting them to the grassland for animal husbandry and other related stuff. So yeah, I cannot give you a more straightforward answer to it, I guess. But let me know if I could answer your question. Am I still audible?
Yeah, you're absolutely audible. Saurav, is there anyone who is having a question? I hope Anu have got the answer.
Oh, wow. Wow. So Anu says she's interested in one lake restoration project in an urban area and planning to document insects. That's really nice. Could you please point what are the other parameters can I look into without much research equipments? Okay. Okay, I think it needs more discussion as well. Like at the top of my mind, I can tell you that with very simple equipments like multi-parameter probes, you can look into the dissolved oxygen, total dissolved related. There are ways to count the biological oxygen demand, chemical oxygen demand in the lakes as well. You can also uh, looking at aspects of eutrophication in the urban lakes. I hope you are talking about urban lakes in urban setting as well. Uh, and I think pH is another very important parameters. And there are few parameters related to nutrient overloading in lake as well. Now, feel free to get in touch with me. I'll just leave my email ID in the chat as well. If you have further questions, you can. I am open to have a chat anytime you like. If you are interested about this ecosystem restoration and other related stuff. Uh, yes, that's my email ID. Yeah, thank you so much for this question. That's really and I wish you that's really interesting, and I wish you all the best for your upcoming stuff. And please feel free to get in touch with me. You can just drop me an email. I'll follow up. Thank you
Thank you.
everyone for.
Thank you so much, Saurabh. Your wonderful presence have really inspired all of us to work on this tropical area. And we're lovely to have you today. Thank you so much. Thank you everyone for joining.
Yeah, thank you so much.